several books dedicated mostly on global and geopolitics. And today a talk will be dedicated to so hot topic like, not hot, so like maybe coronavirus, but still UK leaving the European Union and what it means for Russia. Today, I guess we will talk about how the UK exit from the European Union can affect relationships between Russia and the EU. We would make both sides move like closer or move like toward each other, and maybe we'll talk about some other consequences. I mean, Brexit consequences, except of political and economic ones. So I guess from after the presentation, we'll have some short Q&A session. Just raise your hand and turn the mic on. So I guess I will give the floor to Professor Anis. Professor Anis, the floor is yours.
I know that people started panicking because, I mean, for obvious reason, it's so much in media. 500,000 people every year dies from normal, what we consider as a normal flu. And it's not in media. If you put all the time in media, of course, you know, people will start worrying about this. So while coming here, because so it was for me tricky to find a place, you know, so I leave the metro here and then I'm trying to find. And on the way, I stop some people and they say, "Are you from Italy?" So that was the first question, you know. And then since I said, okay, I'm not coming from Italy, then they said, okay, we help you. Because, you know, if you are from Italy, we are not sure that we're going to help you now. So it's natural. Yesterday, my public talk at Moscow State University has been also cancelled because they suspended. They suspended the whole international programs, meaning the exchange, the inbound students and the teachers. So the order came. So it's natural. So is it realistic? Is it based on facts? We don't know, but it's something which is obvious because, you know, so many countries and so much talk is about it. So coming back to the topic, I think it was Churchill who was telling, okay, there is nothing new in history. The only chapters that you didn't read before. So essentially, even before the Brexit or after the Brexit, there is no big, let's say, difference in the basis of Europe. What is Europe? And this is what I tried in several books to hint or to explain. So it depends on the book that I published. Then I was putting this spice because many issues, you know, so rethinking how Soviet Union has disappeared, how Eastern Europe has disappeared. This is a no-go, you know, so it's a topic that sucks, you know, nobody is interested in this. And of course, if you are scientists, you know, if we are researchers, you know, there is no illegitimate question. In science, you have to question everything. You have to, you know, in faith, you go to church or to mosque or to synagogue, not, you know, to get the empirical proof. That's a fundamental difference, you know. It's based on a belief. It's based on a deeper inner conviction about the existence of some supranational whatever, however you want to describe God, quantum physics or whatever, you know, quantum field or however you want to explain what is God. Okay? So that means you want to belong, you want to surrender yourself to a bigger being, to omnipresence of this being, and it's based on your deep conviction. And then in the core of all of it is actually a belief. So belief you don't question, okay? And science is something that you have to question. I have never thought, you know, 20, 30 years ago that I have to start lectures with this, you know, but apparently we have lost, you know, the knowledge about the basics, you know. Science cannot be correct. Science can give you, any science, can give you the least wrong answer. So the fundamental prerequisite, the fundamental task of every scientific person or researcher is to ask. Last thing in the evening and the first thing in the morning. So certain things we just, so we started believing into that. We started to believe, so communism was bad, so we have forgotten, and we believe, the next day, as soon as we wash the hands from our own past, the better day and the sun comes. This is a belief that has nothing to do with the science. That has nothing to do with the research. And then usually you are committing mistake. You are perpetuating, certain troubles. I remember when I came, in one of the books long ago, when I came to the conclusion, that actually out of 6 dissolutions on planet, 3 were affecting Slavic people of the Eastern Europe. I remember, so it was a Sunday afternoon. My wife was cooking somewhere there, and then I said, okay, so I discovered the big truth, when you press on a switch, the light comes on, and when you press again, light goes off. And she said, you are crazy, you snap out, you better take your lunch and ride a bike, do whatever, okay? I thought I came to the common place. Then I was like going through the literature, there is nothing. Then I was deploying my assistant, there is nothing. Then I took the whole cohort of students, search everything, there is nothing. So it's like in a Houdini way, someone was taking away, from the entire academic debate, the fact that 3 multinational Slavic countries have disappeared. And we said, we just washed our hands from communism. Wait a moment. Ideology and the state are 2 different things. So based on that, I started going, a little bit, revisiting certain chapters, and I came to something which is postulated as 5 historical Europes. And usually, especially when I'm out of Europe, I'm giving a key to people to understand how Europe functions. It's just a definition, how Europeans will always function. And by this classification, so there is a classification, the atheistic religions, the Catholic, the Orthodox, this and that, the Protestant, the Catholic, the South, the North, the old EU members, the new EU members, the non-EU members. There are different classifications of Francophonic, Germanophonic, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but the essential for understanding of the behavior is actually historical Europe. And this is the Atlantic Europe, this is Central Europe, this is Russophonic Europe, this is Eastern Europe and Scandinavian Europe. And once we understand those 5 Europes, we more or less we can with the precision we can analyze the events and how they will function. So by that, when you have foreign affairs of currency taking place, then the Atlantic Europe will be always trigger happy. They would be very eager to make an intervention. Okay, they would be very ready to go over 7 seas, 7 oceans. Then per definition, the Central Europe will pay the bill, Scandinavian Europe will be absent, Russophonic Europe will oppose to this, and Eastern Europe will bandwagon, because they don't have their opinion. They're just bandwagoning. So who is stronger, they side up. Okay? So how it comes? So the Atlantic Europe is the first which is formed. And it's based on the principle of so-called nation state. Now I'm jumping, so if you're interested in the structural stuff, you find it primarily in my literature, unfortunately. But you can, of course, when I said there is nothing in literature, there is nothing coherent in literature. Of course, if you go to Kissinger, to Brzezinski, to anyone, of the Western academia and the intellectuals, you will find things, but not in a coherent way. Okay? That explains you why and how. Okay, so the Atlantic Europe based on the nation state. What is very important to understand, the nation state principle has been practically a child or the baby of Atlantic Europe, and the nation state has been determined on the linguistical grounds. This is very important for understanding. but it's on a linguistical ground. So what meant that? Meant from here to there they are francophonic dialects, and therefore we will create the state. Because after the Peace of Westphalia, the religious grounds were not inappropriate to determine what would be a modern state. So we have two parallel processes. One is the ultimate quest of the Jacobins and the French Revolution and so on and so forth, which was brewing, was just manifested by 1789. But this thought, this idea of organizing the societal forces and making a social cohesion and creating a fabrics on other grounds, but the obedience to the Pope sitting in Rome, so this idea was there already. So the Jacobins were just the manifestation of the tip of the iceberg. So it was far earlier there. Okay, so practically, then we have the Atlantic flank of Europe that is creating the first nation states. And then the Hispanophonic dialects from here to there, it will be Spain. Then Portugophonic dialects from here, because there were no languages. The languages that we use, you use Russian, now we use English. Those, I mean, this what we consider as language is nothing else but the convent. It's actually a consensus of linguists of certain times who were making convention. So the English that we use and many other languages are just, in a way, if you want to put it, a fabrication, a creation, an invention of the linguists of the certain time, who for practical reasons wanted to create something which is standard, which all people in this country would understand perfectly and would communicate. And especially the early industrialization was necessitating people to communicate, the postal services and so on and so forth. Okay, so practically you have them. And then what is also situated in Atlantic Europe are the so-called first round of colonizers. It's the first round of colonizers, the two Iberian countries, and then followed by second and the third round of colonizers, France, Dutch, Britons, Swedes, and Danish, you know, so we shouldn't forget them. Very often we are forgetting. And then, parallel to this process, you have the Russophones. Russophones receiving actually the Christianity from directly in a contact with the Roman Empire, which also we constructed to call Byzantium. I mean, when you go to the old books, you know, there is no word Byzantium. Byzantium has been invented far later, actually. This is the legal successor of the Roman Empire, because Constantine the Great has moved the official seat from Rome to the fascinating place that touches two continents, you know, two continents are coming to each other, you know. It's most probably one of the top few places of the planet, the most, you know, dramatic places. And he says, I want the city to be built. Actually, the Greek colony was existing there, and this is Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul. Okay, so the official seat has been moved, and the official successor has been sitting on Bosphorus. So there is no Eastern and Western Roman Empire and the collapse of Eastern and Western. Those are the constructions in literature that have come later, and I still am very surprised that we are peddling this strong rhetoric. Anyway, so and then of course you know it far better, your own history. Then those Khaganates, the Russophonic Khaganates, okay, people who were still living before, let's say, modern and organized state in today's terms, they've been creating the first so-called Kiev Russia. And then, so it's a parallel process. As the Atlantic Europe is seeing certain potentials overseas, Russians are going to the north, they are contested with the Swedes, and they finally come to the sea. There is not much to go further to the north. And then they're advancing to east. So practically, there are two parallel worlds and two parallel processes, which is very important. You see how many times I mentioned parallel process. So this mystification, this scrutinization, this demonization of Russia in Western media has roots in that. This is a deeper psychological, actually emotional place in most of the Western people when they are demonizing Russia. And of course, Russians are trying to explain themselves. You know, sometimes they try, sometimes they say, okay, what the hell, we don't want to explain ourselves, you know. So those are, so usually, but it's always in a position, you know, that some negative rhetorics, you know, some finger is always posted on Russia. And it goes back to the schism of the church. And when you frankly speak with the Western people, you know, you have to ask them, okay, so what has been taught to you in school? And it must be some sort of the trauma which has been transformed from the literature of the first history books that creates this emotional charge. And this is very important, you know. So, and I think, so as I said, it's irrational and it's an emotional charge. That something has been taken long ago, okay, from them. And that's exactly this primacy, this premium on interpretation of Christianity. And this neuralgic feeling, you know, of the West to prove itself as the right one. Unfortunately, you know, so the most rational explanation that I came after so many decades of reading history, meeting people, teaching, listening, you know, being taught and teaching, you know, this is the closest that I come to. That this is based on this actually irrationality of the two parallel worlds. And not before Peter the Great, actually, Russia comes back to what is considered as Europe. Only then. And starts participating in let's say, in the inner dynamic of Europe. Okay, so that means we have already two Europes. And then the Scandinavian Europes, when the Swedes were getting, settling down, and the Danish were getting to the possessions, more or less, so that constitutes Scandinavian Europe, which is practically a neutral. So the synonym for the Scandinavian Europe is neutrality. They are practically neutral. They're absent from most of the affairs. Sometimes in an active way. I will elaborate on this hopefully later, but this is their absence. It's not a passive absence, it's active one. And then the trouble comes after the constituting phases of European history with the Atlantic and with the Russophonic Europe and Scandinavian. Then the center started, which was for centuries soft. And the entire dynamics of European power politics was based actually on peripheries pressing on a center, including however you want to treat Ottomans. You know, you can treat them as peripheral or external power. In a religious and civilizational sense, they are external one. And also the Russians, you know, sometimes in literature they say Russia is peripheral, sometimes it's external. I believe Russians are essentially European people, 100%. So it's a peripheral. So the peripheral powers, France, Spain, England, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottomans, they are pressing on a center. So they are peripheral to the center. They are on the continent, so they are pressing. And then with the Napoleon III, you know that the Napoleon has been defeated primarily by Russia. So practically then the nephew comes, Napoleon III, who is obsessed with the unification of Italophones. Since he grew up with the Italian carbonaras. Carbonara has nothing to do with pizza. Carbonaras are freedom fighters of Italy. So he grew up in Nice. Nice was in Italy at that time. He fought Austrians. So two things he was very obsessed. He hated Austria, and he believed, because Vienna Congress, you know, Russians did the job, you know, but the Congress was in Vienna. So Vienna Congress of 1415 was actually putting France into sort of a cage. So he was obsessed with the possible historical moment in which he will fight back Austria on, let's say, the geopolitical ground, and on an ideological ground he wanted to create state of the telephones. And then the trouble was basically that once you started the process of unification on one corner of Europe, you can't stop the similar process on the other side. So the Prussia, interestingly, or mistakenly, or however, mistakenly definitely for Napoleon III, Prussia was headed by the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and he didn't understood this. So Bismarck was brilliant, was very ruthless on the battlefield, but was brilliant in diplomacy. So he created an enormous network of diplomatic ties all over Europe, but he was quick and decisive in wars. He prepared himself well. He strikes very quickly and he stops. So what happens? Actually, Prussia was making a series of very good moves. So Prussia is firstly defeating Denmark with the neutrality of Napoleon III. And Napoleon III, sitting in Paris, he didn't understand that actually Prussia is already getting closer to his possessions. Because Denmark, so sometimes I say to my students, so you would never say, but actually the Austrian neighbors were Denmark and Turks. And then students are, who are not versed of geography or history, they are surprised. But that was it, To the north of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or Austrian Empire before, was Denmark, because northern portions of today's Western Germany were controlled by Danish, and central and southern portions by Austrians. So practically, Prussia is defeating Denmark. Then there is the Austrian-Prussian War, not to go into too many details. Okay, so practically Prussia is extending itself from the, tentatively speaking, what was DDR into what was the Western Germany. Okay, so practically to the size of today's Germany, and they are pressing on a border with France. And then finally, it was a question of time. By 1870, there is a Franco-Prussian War, in which, of course, the Prussia is defeating shamefully French, and they enter in Paris, and what a shame, the unification of Germany or extension of Prussia has been proclaimed in the middle of Paris by 71. And at that time, Garibaldi is entering Rome, because the deal was not to touch Papal states, to unite telephones. So practically, by 71, a process started in a naive way, ruthless and in a naive way, by Napoleon III. In a matter of 2 decades, we had actually solidification of center of Europe, and we had completely new situation. The entire geopolitical constellation was based on periphery pressing on a soft center. Okay, so it has changed. And then with the new Kaiser, who was rather provincial and not to the task, he strips off Bismarck, and then he surrounds himself with the people who are simply, unable to understand the circumstances. So Bismarck leaves them a very powerful, very mighty state in a center of Europe, and they don't know what to do. And one of the possible interpretations why we in Europe ended up in 2 world wars is actually that the leadership of Germany didn't know what to do with it. And they contested themselves and the rest of the globe, with this power. Like giving a real gun to a little child. So child can really make a big harm because he's not understanding what is happening, in a way. Okay, so that meant, tremendous, actually tectonic moves in Europe, the solidification of Central Europe. And finally, we come to Eastern Europe, which is not mentioned so far. Those are the realities in the best case. Those are the brand new countries. In the best case, they are old 100 years, and in most cases, they are practically existing just 2-3 decades. They are neuralgic. They are not sure about the position in space and time. They have overtones. They are short of so-called geostrategic depth. So they have all the time this tension inside, and they always grasp and look for security. They are obsessively looking for security. They're very dismissive with Russia because they feel, okay, Russia has been collapsing in historical terms, and there is a bigger master who will protect them. So they are all the time keen on security. Security is, so it's not the well-being of population, infrastructure, industrialization, right side of history, not wrong side of history, fight and of legacy of anti-fascism. That's not an agenda. On agenda is actually security. The public security. So it's also something which you can explain because they are novelty on the map. So that conglomerate of countries creates Eastern Europe. And this is basically dynamics of Europe. And once we understand these dynamics, we can see and we can analyze every foreign policy occurrence that happens, how it will react. So then we tentatively, explaining this, we can tentatively say that the Atlantic Europe is a political powerhouse. And indeed, out of 5 Security Council members, 2 are from Atlantic flank of Europe. It's France and Britain. Okay. Then Central Europe is the economic powerhouse. Then the Russophone Europe is the energy powerhouse. Scandinavian Europe is a little bit of all of it, what I mentioned. A little bit energy, a little bit economy, a little bit politics. And Eastern Europe is nothing of it. And those are the European realities. So now we have the situation in which actually Britain is out of the so-called EU club. Britain, since actually extension of the British civilization is United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. So of course, naturally, that the strong links between United States that became later superpower and replaced Britain on the seas, actually that United States and Britain had, let's say, shared sentiment. If it's shared sentiment, this so-called transatlantic or cross-Atlantic, however you want to put it, dimension has been very prone also within the EU. Now with the Britain out, actually it will be more consideration of the continental Europe, because Great Britain is an island country. And if you talk with the Britons, they would say often, we the islanders and the continent. That's how they would call Europe. So we should be lucky we are not a continent, we are the continent. Okay? Fish of high seas, this is how they portray themselves. Okay, it's us here and the continent is there. So it's us and them. It's that paradigm. Even, when you talk with the French over Germans and the sentiments for centuries, so they were very negative, very odd to each other. Or if you talk to Polish and Russians and the Germans and the French about each other, they would never say us and them. So there is understanding that we are on a very small continent next to each other. But with the Britons, it would be that. So what does it mean now? With the exit of Great Britain from EU, which still, decoupling lasts. You can't really just leave next day, So there are a lot of things to, and those operative links will be there for many years to come. So what happens? France and Germany are understanding that certain balances are disrupted, and we are coming to the old power politics game. And the fundamental question of this power politics game, or power game, or geopolitical game, is who does the accommodation with Russia? Is it France or Germany? Because what we have now in the constellation, as I explain you 5 historical Europes, EU, I'm sure you know it very well. EU is a political peace process. It turned later, so we have this funny money and, so we don't have borders and all those things, that came far later. But the essence of EU has been actually a peace project by which, embodied in Elysee Accord of 61, in which actually France reapproached Germany and they said, okay, so we accept your prone say in economic affairs if you accept ours in political affairs. So this was the way of reapproachment. So practically it is a deal between the Atlantic Europe and Central Europe, led by, on one side, France, and on the other side, led by Germany. Central Europe, in a historical sense, is also Turkey, it's Austria, it's Germany, and Italy. Just to know. And although Turkey is eastern from Greece, Greece is part of the Eastern Europe, historical Europe. That means your history tells you where do you belong, not your position. Okay. So practically, now the question comes up whether and how, in which terms, to make actually reapproachment to Russia. And firstly, to start cooling of this hot air and this, so practically irrationalities, and come to terms. And secondly, to see larger realities. I was also prolifically writing about this. To see larger realities. And larger realities is, if the Western world is interested in any side, any type of parity with classical Asia, Confucian Asia, they need Russia. I would go even beyond, if you're interested in any sustainable development, in any, anything on this planet, you should reapproach Russia. You can't put Russia away. But at least that little, And I think that this debate is ongoing. Now, unfortunately, there is a whole calamity with oil. I know it's a critical also moment for Russia, and the promises of leadership, to deliver to its own population, let's say, a good standard of living and to modernize and all other things. Because Russia was practically, since the times of, even before Peter the Great, you didn't really have a holiday from history. You never had a break. Many nations had a break. So that means, there was always some urgent things to do, and there were always urgent issues to be dealt and reactions to do. So now with the calamity of oil and the entire, let's say, turbulences on the stock exchanges, of course, which directly then hits the currencies. This is a little bit diverting attention, but I think attention will go into direction of actually reconsidering, revisiting, and recalibrating actually the approach towards Russia. And of course, that would be, I think also Russia changed in a way. In the 90s it would be far easier. As soon as the signal would come from Brussels, Paris, or Berlin, Moscow would be very eager to do things. But now, after so long and after suffering that has been delivered to this population, I'm not sure that leadership is eager just to jump like this, if the signal comes. And what is very, very worrying is actually that we have had this situation. Excluding very important partners is the best recipe for big calamity. We had League of Nations in which actually, and we should not forget this, to which actually Germany and Russia were not admitted at all. Germany, due to the so-called guilt clausule, so because they had was understanding practically nearly embodied in International Treaty of Versailles, that Germany is a prime cause of the First World War, and therefore they be not admitted to the collective system, security system, and Russia, due to its ideological, let's say, color, which was not liked by that time creators of the collective system, and United States, because Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and he was repeatedly rejected. So practically you had very important countries that were outside of the collective system. And then, you know, so when you analyze the economic crisis and this, you know, so then there was no actually no wonder that we ended up in the Second World War. And even more interestingly, or more cynical, or more sad, however you want to put it, is that basically there is no single document of League of Nations by which they recognize realities of the outbreak of the Second World War. There is nothing. They've been sitting in Geneva and Palais des Nations and talking, you know, and the war was coming up. And there are anecdotes even that the Swiss police was coming and apprehending some diplomats and telling, we are really sorry, but you have to leave the country. And they said, okay, so of course there was a fuss. And they said, listen, your country has disappeared. We would love to extend you diplomatic visa, but your country does not exist anymore. So these guys were so absent that they even didn't recognize the realities, that they will not have a passport. But they've been sitting, because, you know, international organization easily consumes you, you know. So you forget realities. And this is very, very worrying, you know. Excluding anyone, satanizing anyone is very, very tricky. Is as tricky as a precedent. Even be it little Cuba or be it little Korea. Not to mention larger countries, you know. So it's very, very tricky, and it creates very bad habit. And then, of course, on interpretations, you know, which we had recently with the accusation of communism with Nazism and so on and so forth. So all those things, you know, going back actually to the chapters. And when Russia was Soviet Russia, but it doesn't matter. Russia is a reality, be it communist or not communist. Russia was reality that many at that time didn't want to recognize. So practically, so how it was coming before, and the Versailles Treaty and Locarno Treaty that created practically two classes of borders in Europe. And then you jump, you know, and then the shameful war, a very, let's say, traumatic war between Poland and Russia and so on and so forth. And then you jump selectively on Ribbentrop-Molotov deal, actually without taking into consideration everything that was reality in Europe before that. And primarily the inability of the League of Nations to recognize realities, to address them, and to fight with them. So those are very important things. And if Europe is serious, I mean, when I say Europe, I mean European Union and those countries surrounded or very, very closely linked to that, to EU, notably Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. So if they are very serious about their future, they also have to find the answer and the proper balance with Asia or with the American continent. And again, in this, you need let's say, very active and very smart and fair assessment of how to actually make a dynamic with Russia, which would be win-win, not lose-lose. So I think I stop now.
Thanks so much, Professor Anis. I guess we can
maybe discuss a bit further.
Yeah, maybe if you have any question, just raise your hand and turn the mic on. So as far as I understand, Professor Anis, Europe needs Russia as a bridge between Europe and Asia. It needs Russia more European. It needs Russia as an ally, as far as I get your point.
Exactly. I mean, it's exactly this. So any history book, you know, if you read, you know, so even if you are diligent pupil in school, you know, so that little history that you get in school would be evidence enough. Or if you just take a map of the world, you know, it's not needed much. Actually, much is needed, you know, to be on opposite side. And this is what all the time was like, you know, was a splinter in my mind. I was thinking, why this emotional charge? People really get upset, you know, talking so let's say, demonizing Russia for so many things, you know. So and why emotion? You know, I don't want now to compare. You know, so there are many problems. There are many countries, you know, around, you know, and very often they go on a collision course with different Western countries, but still, in the end, you know, so there is not so much emotional charge, and it has to go into certain explanations of the earlier historical books and the chapters, you know. So that means, you know, that people in the EU primarily have to consider, you know, reconsider actually their own stance and views. And in the end, you know, so I was the other day in the OSCE, I was talking with the Ukrainians, and of course they also emotionally overcharged, you know, with all what happens in Ukraine. And I had, okay, finally, tell me, who is interested for territorial integrity of your country? And then they look at me, and I said, I help you. There is just one country on this planet that is interested in your territorial integrity, that you still remain as you are. And this is not United States, this is not EU, this is Russia. Russia is your reality. Sit, swallow, however bitter is, and fix your realities. Because country is not on wheels, you know. You don't like your neighbors, you know. So one morning, you know, you can divorce from your wife or husband, you know, but you can't divorce from your neighbors, unfortunately. You know, one day you realize, you know, you don't like neighbor, you know, and you move away. It's impossible. You have to fix reality. And, you know, so once you start, you know, controlling your emotional charge and the supply of emotional charge, and it would eventually also go, you know, so Europe was really, you know, saved several times. And it was, after all, you know, whoever and however was the leadership of Gorbachev, one day they really believed altruistically, you know, for the better tomorrow. And they imposed sacrifice on entire nation, believing that tomorrow comes the better day. And I haven't seen this from the West. Was the Napoleonic War, Russia suffered. Was a Hitler, you know, was Russia, you know. Was the change in the liberalization and whatever promised world was 98, was 89, you know, and 90 and 91. But who did finally all the sacrifice? It was again this same world. And why do you hate this world? You know, Americans, if you talk with them directly, they would, of course, nothing else but to admit this. You know, they for the most of their history, they had the holidays. They didn't participate. They sent some soldiers. At the end of the First World War, they sent some monies, you know, and they sent some soldiers, you know. In Russia, in Poland, in my country, you know, there is no family without people dying, you know. In First and the Second War, is too much, you know. Nothing was higher than 20 centimeters. Everything has been destroyed. One army, second army. And these guys are, end of 70, they sent some soldiers. They had the Civil War, but Civil War was also, you know, limited on a scope, on how much it affected civilian population and so on and so forth. And in the Second World War, you know, Americans suffered in Pacific in a way. But in Europe, you know, so after Normandy and eventually with Italy in late 43, you know, without any advances, you know, so their advances was taking over 1 year, you know, from Italy. They eventually entered Rome late summer, I think in August 44 only. So practically they had holidays from history. So they are involved, really, they are fully capacitated and absorbed by history, mesmerized by history, only from 30s. I mean, essentially from the second part of 30s, because I think Roosevelt understood what is going on, what will happen. And they've been just calculating, because Japan was switching the sides like Italy, so which side they will take. But I think Roosevelt was clear by 37. That, I mean, over direction that United States will be affected. So practically, that gives you a comfortable situation, you know. And for the most of Europe, also Britain in a way had the holidays from history, you know. But for most of the continental Europe, and especially for Russia, there was no holiday, there was no break. All the time, you know, history is overheated. I mean, to be frank, also the same applies to Turks. You know, it's easy to criticize, you know, Erdogan this, Erdogan that, you know, Putin this, Putin that. But look at your neighborhood. Look at how it looks like. You know. Look at the neighborhood of Russia. Look at the neighborhood also of Turkey. It's exceptionally difficult neighborhood. Also, I mean, just from that perspective, you know, just to relax tensions and to say, okay, so for God's sakes, you know, these guys were never having a break of history, and we need them because they're pivot. Also Iranians, you know, so for Iranians, it's a bridge between Eurasia, you know. It's also overheated, you know, pressure from all sides. And then, of course, with the pressure, you shut the plane, you do this, you do that, you know. I'm not giving excuses, but I'm trying to find the rational explanation, you know. It's easy, you know, to be Prime Minister of Iceland, you know. So I'm not disrespectful, you know. But, you know, your neighborhood is calm. Not many things are happening, you know. Most of your existence, you had the holidays from history. There were no critical decisions. There were no, you know, urgent issues to deal with.
There are two questions. The first, yeah. Yeah, please just, can you please just come and turn Zoom? Yeah. Yeah, push the button, yeah.
Yeah. I've got one question concerning the topic of your lecture, the post-Brexit future of the EU. The current European Commission is called geopolitic one due to the fact that the current head of European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, put forward some geopolitical ideas about the enhancement of significance of the EU as the actor on the global arena and so on. From your perspective, what do you think actually about the interrelation between the EU and Russia, well, taking into consideration the stance of the new European Commission and some figures like the new head of European Foreign Affairs, Jean Borrell, and so on? Will it be the continuation of the previous course? Or the previous European Commission, or there will be the new course, and we have something like a exacerbation in the relationship between the EU and Russia. And one more question concerning this topic. From your perspective, do you think actually that this idea of creating connectivity between the EU and Eurasian Economic Union is viable or not? Thank you.
to answer your questions each would be another lesson, or excellent one. So you captured actually the most important issues. Listen, answering to that, I'm not sitting in a council, and even if I was Ursula, so still I have to deal with the others in the commission. It's not by chance that I was explaining you 5 historical Europes. You have to understand that there is an opening for France and Germany, and that they are trying actually to reposition themselves. And there is a belief that actually Germany understands more Russia, and it's let's say more sensitive on needs of Russia. And that this has been created also by let's say those energy links, I believe it's over exaggerated, and it has been pumped also by transatlantic media. But that's the feeling, that the Germany has more understanding to Russia. So what could be expected is actually that France is also starting sending a signal. So since this is so to say game in two, one of the fundamental issues will be also how Russia is turning to that. Unfortunately, the central and the Atlantic portion of Europe is becoming less and less relevant, not only politically but also economically. And the fundamental question, if I was sitting here in the leading structures, I would just put a calculation, and put all my civilizational belongings and attachments and emotions, aside, and I would make a clear calculate. And Europe is actually losing on a daily basis importance. One has to be now in the Pacific theater, in Indo-Pacific actually, on Strait of Malacca, and those are 2 countries which are absolutely, you can't find anything in media about, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia. And those 2 countries are practically with the Singapore down. So those 2 countries are bordering the Strait of Malacca. And Strait of Malacca, 54% of everything manufactured and traded today in the world is passing Straits of Malacca. It's not La Manche, unfortunately. It's not Gibraltar. And of course, for the real, how shall I say, players, this is absolutely clear and understandable. History, Europe still has a memory about its past, so there is still residual, image about how important it used to be before. But it's losing on its importance. And I'm not sure, as I said, Moscow would be sending different signals in the 90s, and I'm not sure about which signals they would be and how eager they would be to go into a sincere relation in 2020. Not sure about that. Because a lot would depend on that. But there is an opening, and both France and Germany understood, and it's not commission, it's practically member states. And they are top executives, so it's Macron, and on the other side, it's Iba Muti. So practically they are sending those signals, so that in a way there is a new opening. And then finally, so whether we would have some sort of a merger between the Euro-Asian Economic Union and EU, it's an excellent question. It's $1 million question, Frankly speaking, I think for Russia and China, it becomes less and less important, in different terms. And I think the sooner Europeans, the EU understands, they would be eager and let's say more prone to sit over the table and to discuss. And not to mention Middle East, because the Russian re-entry into Middle East was also an event par excellence. After practically 30 years, Russia is stabilizing, and Russia has stopped effectively regime change. When you don't like someone, you send bombs and you change them. and you create chaos. Per definition, you know, starting with former Yugoslavia, with Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, you know, the attack was massive attack and misuse, either absolutely bypassing everything in New York, or by actually misusing the existing resolutions, like 1971, 1973 on Libya, which were not talking about any intervention. So practically, then you destroy the properties and let's say infrastructure of the country. You pull out the strongest organized force of society. Whoever was Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party, whoever was Gaddafi and his structure, this was the only structure that state was having. So you pull this structure, it's like, imagine, you know, so someone takes our skeleton, we are nothing. Okay? So that was happening with those countries, so it created actually a huge vacuum out of it. So the re-entry of Russia was the evidence, it was reverberating, you know, all over the Middle East, you know, that actually regime change will be not allowed, and that certain status quo and some gradual change would be happening in the Middle East from now on. And effectively, you know, Assad remains in office. Whoever Assad is, he was more or less elected by in a legitimate process, or at least in a process which was not contested. Now they are talking about dictator, but why you are not talking about this? You know, at the time of when the guy comes to office, you can't do it. You know, post festum. So the fact that Syria is ruled by this governing structure was not contested. Syria and its government has been recognized by international community, and this was the way how it was running up to 11, 12 when it started. I think 12 in Syria. So that means practically there is no abruptive change, there is no bombing of the country. So Syria is a turning point. And this turning point was practically happening with Russian involvement. So if Europeans are sincere about their own future, about the Middle East, because Euromed, we are very much exposed. Therefore we talk about one civilization, it's a cradle of civilization that is coming. You know, Carthago, Greece, Rome, you know, this is a cradle of European civilization. So it's Euromed, it's a Mediterranean theater. It's not Europe, it's not the classical Europe. You know, Aristotle was not from Denmark, you know, he was not living next to Copenhagen. He was in Mediterranean, so it's a Euromed. The Carthago, Phoenicians, you know, they've been to the Middle Eastern portion of this Mediterranean basin, not from European side, and so on and so forth. So practically, without Russia, that's impossible. And then finally, the big premium of Russian say and the posture is when it comes to Asia, to classical Asia, or as we call it, Confucian Asia. You know. But as I said, you know, so sometimes the obvious things are, you know, very difficult to grasp in the politics, and probably, you know, we will see how dynamics is going, and Russia is not sending very warm signals in a way, you know, that would jump so easily. I think Russia would first and most of all wait for real deeds before actually getting, let's say, far warmer and let's say more receptive signals towards the EU. So that's my assumption. And of course, as I said, you know, so you can't analyze the chess game, you know, because it's played, you know, between two parties, you know, so you can't give the final result because you don't see it, you know. You can see and predict a couple of moves that are coming, and you eventually know which direction dynamic could take if certain moves are going in this direction, for example. A very good question.
Yep. Any questions? Yeah, I see if there is no more questions against, we can.
You wanted to put some.
Yeah, actually, I had two questions. The first question was actually pretty the same, and my second question was rather obvious. The question was Brexit. I mean, it may sound obvious, but nevertheless, does it make Brexit? Does it make it the EU bigger? I mean, there are a lot of. I mean, not speaking economically. There are a lot of points, expert points that it will cause like domino effect or something like that.
On Brexit, I'm not sure. It was so tedious. It was so tedious and so complex. We have to see, you know. So the West is apparently in a sort of a decline, and we have to see how it will turn with the let's say the residual feeling and how those feelings will be articulated within the Northern Ireland. We saw also Sinn Féin victory in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. What kind of articulation will come out in Scotland? So what could be as a sort of consequence that we have a further fragmentation of nation state in Atlantic flank of Europe. So practically it would be extremely difficult if Scots are going for a referendum to negate this, and then if the referenda is successful, to negate, you know, the outcome of the Catalans in Spain. So that would trigger eventually some sort of a domino effect in which actually the nation state would be going into fragmentation. Something that already have happened. You know, we should not forget the three multinational, multilinguistic countries have disappeared out of 6 dissolutions, as I mentioned this in the beginning. So we had in the last 60, 70 years, practically we had 6 dissolutions on this planet. So no dissolution was affecting American continent. Africa was affected with 2 dissolutions. This was both on Horn of Africa. One was Ethiopia and Eritrea, and one was Sudan and South Sudan. And then we had one in Asia, which was affecting Indonesia with East Timor. And then comes the interesting thing that Europe was suffering 3 dissolutions, and all 3 were in Eastern Europe, and all 3 were affecting practically Slavic world, or predominantly Slavic countries. Okay, this was Soviet Union, this was Czechoslovakia, that was Yugoslavia. And still we have this residual heat of those dissolutions happening still around, you know. And on the edges of either Soviet Union, and especially of Yugoslavia, the only calm is Czechoslovakia, which underwent the dissolution between Czech and Slovak republics, and it lives in rather, let's say, simple ways. It lives the life of the 2 countries. So that's it. But it's very interesting that practically those 3 dissolutions were taking place, and that we usually don't visit those chapters by telling, okay, this is the ideology that we put to an end. We put this ideology to the rest, so we don't discuss this. You know, communism is over, that's it. You know, but we are not actually going into the analysis. So you can change ideological spectrums and ideological setups in the country, but that dissolution and the change of ideology are 2 different things. And we didn't discuss them thoroughly. So before closing, so essentially on the challenges, I mean, we discussed already 5 historical Europes. What is especially evident is the industrialization. It's a generational warfare that is taking place. It's the anti-fascism and Slavism, the questions of do we stand still on the legacy of anti-fascism in Europe? Equitation of Nazism with anything is the beginning of actually denial. And this tremendous evil must be having its own category. We can't compare this, because the first moment when you compare this with the communism, who were the communist countries? These were the Slavic countries. This end up into anti-Slavic feelings. And therefore it has to be stopped before that. And then we have to ask, is Europe still on the legacy of anti-fascism or not? So where do we stand? What we are here on this continent? And we should never forget that practically the territorial, the whole story about Central Europe, I'm explaining this in books. So the whole point of Central Europe is they need space. And they knock on a door in different ways, sometimes with the artillery pieces, sometimes really, they knock on the door of Atlantic Europe and they say, hey, you conquered the world, give us some of your colonies. And the Atlantic Europe says, no, go to Eastern Europe, this is the place you can find. And that also explains why 2 wars, because the Central Europe was primarily attacking Atlantic Europe. Look, the Duke has been assassinated. Was Serbia, was Russia, blah, blah, blah. Who was behind? Okay, so he was assassinated in my birth town. This happens on very important religious holiday, but doesn't matter, okay? They are military maneuvers. 28th of June. The first military operations are not taking place before late autumn. So there is an ultimatum of Austria to Serbia, because they think, okay, Serbia is behind, then Russia supports Serbia, then by those chain reaction, everybody declares war to everyone. So already by the midsummer, everybody is technically in war. So the casus belli is actually in southeastern Europe. It's Austria that was losing the heir to the throne from the country which is very far away on the southeastern Europe. This is a casus belli. And if there is something to punish, you have to punish there. So it has to be Austrians going on Serbia. So what is the first military activity in Europe? Is Germans attacking Ardennes. So the problem is there, but you fight there. This is what happens. And that explains you the very nature. So Central Europe is interested in actually redistributing colonies over the seas. But with the Brest-Litovsk peace, the only success, paradoxically enough, Lenin comes and the early Bolsheviks and so on and so forth, they don't see reality of state, they believe, so it's a communist cause, they are revolutionaries, they don't see realities, they want to make a world revolution, and so on and so forth. Okay, so paradoxically, the only gains of Germany were to the east, not to the west, and they wanted west. And then Hitler is sitting and contemplating over everything. So what is the Mein Kampf telling? Lebensraum, they need space. And this is what I always say to my Jewish friends, with a full respect. You've been considered by Nazi Germany as non-territorial threat. The line of narrative was that you are controlling banks, you are controlling media, and once you are exterminated, physically eliminated, then the media would be free, and they would be all Nazis and happily ever after, and the money would be freed for the military industry of Nazi Germany. This was the line of narrative, and therefore Jews were systematically, we will never deny this, systematically actually chased, apprehended, and put to the final solution, actually put to be eliminated physically. But the Jews were non-territorial actually threat, the territorial threat, because extermination of Jews was not providing Germany with the Lebensraum. It was a Slavic state. Once you destroy Slavic state, you get the space. And also, I'm so sorry, but the only permanent and coexistent fight of the Nazis in Europe was organized by communists. I'm sorry, but this is a fact. And it was primarily Soviet communists and the Yugoslav communists who organized and who were fighting. So practically 90% of all Hitler's divisions were involved, were engaged, with the Soviets predominantly and the Yugoslavs. And where was the resistance? This was organized by communists, only by communists. I'm sorry, but this is it. So it's very dangerous to put, we had the Stalin, so that was also an evil guy, so that's equal to Nazi. How simple, how wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And as I said, this ends up with anti-Slavism. Because 36 million of Slavs have died to fight. I lost 18 members of my family. And also to be clear, so I lost 2 aunts actually in Sutjeska. Sutjeska was one of the fights with Tito partisans. And then, so they captured, actually, I'm sorry for giving you, but it's a picture, especially for the youngsters. So they captured part of this, so they call it hospital, so people were, so crippled and then they had this typhus and all this stuff, So they captured, the Germans captured some 300 nurses. And if you command, because German army was organized, you can't do things as you wish. So the order to assassinate, to kill them in cold blood without any trial, without any apprehension, because they consider them as bandits. So to kill, it has to come, the command, from major and higher rank. Since Nazi Germany was putting under the army so many people, they promoted in a higher ranks real military officers who finished actually military schools. The rest, especially the lower ranks, from lieutenant up to major or colonel, those lower ranks were people who graduated from normal schools. And the guys who ordered nurses, what kind of military threat in Sutjeska, in 43, nurses are represented. So the guys who were ordered shooting were guys who studied humanistics in Heidelberg and in Berlin. Not SS guys. Not people who were trained in the military academies. People who studied philosophy, political science, those guys. You understand? We should not forget this. Also, when I go to Indonesia, what I'm telling them, so practically, Indonesians, the Dutch were fighting Germans very bravely 4 days. 4 days they fought Germans. Okay, so they've been neighbor, Germany was strong, it's okay. So for 4 days they've been fighting. And finally, technically Americans liberated them, but it was actually, Soviet Union that was taking the whole burden of the war. But technically it was Americans who liberated Dutch. And nearly the first thing the Dutch did after liberation, so for the entire war, no casualties, they are practically, they are telling, okay, so we surrounded ourselves to the stronger enemy and we have to cohabitate, we are not really working with them, but we cohabitate, okay? So they practically, in a nice terms, this is sit and wait attitude, okay? So when you are liberated by someone else, nearly first thing that they did, they assembled the army and they hit 7 seas. And they went back to Indonesia. And they fought Indonesians for 4 years. This is Europe. And that's what I'm telling to my Asian friends. Don't forget what is Europe. Don't get seduced, by nice postcards. This is us. That's us. For 4 years they've been killing them. They fight Nazis for 4 days and they go. You know where is Indonesia? And that was nearly one of the first things they did. They go and they fight them for 4 bitter years. before the Indonesians finally got the independence, you know, as a wreck. And then they tell you, you are poor, you are underdeveloped, you know, where is your infrastructure? How you can have an infrastructure when all the time is a war? So this is very important chapter that we never forget, you know. The first moment when we want to put equitation to anything with Nazism is the negation of Nazism. And it ends up into very, very clear anti-Slavic feelings. So it's not anti-Semitic, it's anti-Slavic. Because usually, you know, so for good reasons, you know, Jews are very, very, especially now they have state of Israel, so they are very prone and they jump, you know, when you start negating it. They are first. But it's not, it is, but it's not only and primarily, it's not anti-Semitic. It's also anti-Slavic. So those are things. And then the evolution, you know, that we are actually going back into some things that we achieved in the past. And then practically also deindustrialization, because massively, especially Eastern Europe, in a way also the Russophone Europe has been deindustrialized. So we are losing actually the potentials. And then finally, which is related to Middle East. And those are questions that EU primarily for itself, but together with the rest of Europe has to answer. And weaponization of the forced migrations, which we have now also, especially from Turkey. They are very nervous overtones coming, okay, so if you don't do this, I will send you refugees and so on and so forth, you know. So it's a weaponization of refugees. But the line, again, you know, so we have to come back, you know, you don't want refugees, stop creating them. You don't like terrorism, stop supporting terrorism. Certain things are very simple, you know, to come, without mystifying and going into too, let's say, many complications unnecessarily. And then by that, actually, what I believe that will save our continent is actually pan-European accommodation. We need a pan-European accommodation, which would be also made on a fair basis. Not EU-Russia, because then, of course, Russia is then facing the whole bloc. It should be a fair accommodation, which is a pan-European. And this is also, you know, a question of very pure survival. So it's not a question of let's say, for me, it's not the question of formulation of foreign policy, but it's a question of survival of European civilization, European continent on the longer run. And then three challenges before I stop. So as we all know, it's a nuclear self-annihilation, which again, you know, they promised us, you know, when the Berlin Wall has been removed, they promised us better future, and I'm legitimately asking, you know, also in my writings, where is this better future? So what we are offered now is a little bit more of the same. Now we are offered with the new Cold War, and the legitimate question is why? Why do we need that? You know. So practically, the nuclear self-annihilation, although was put ad limine nearly in the late 90s and early 2000s, now it comes again, you know, because a lot of tension is there. And a lot of new aspirants are existing. We failed actually as international community to achieve the nuclear-free Middle East. You know, all fuss with the Pakistan and with the Iran would be over if we decide actually we will have a nuclear-free Middle East. And then environmental holocaust, needless to say. Russia also saved, was not paid by much credit for that, saved the Kyoto Protocol because Russia was bringing enough points actually that the first protocol to the FCC convention framework, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was basically getting its life. So it was Russia that signed and ratified the treaty that entered into a force. And now with the Paris and whole set of additional problems with the acidification of oceans, with the plastic use, with the noise, with the debris in outer space and so on and so forth. So wherever human activity comes, we polluted everything. We have no solution to that. And then the technological disruptions, which will affect, in that terms, actually, this is something that brings, in a way, good news for Russia, because Russia has no very good demographic prospects in the near future. So artificial intelligence, which is a technology that reduces human presence, is actually helpful. And I know that Russia is very keen and prone on this technology. But for many other regions, it may bring a lot of disruptions, especially for the younger demographies, for the countries with the traditional, let's say, low employment rates, and with the younger demographic setups. You know, so here in Russia, in Japan, in most of the OECD countries, there is an aging of population, and then this technology is a perfect solution for them. But definitely we need also for that, to tackle this problem like those two before, we need international community. We need intergovernmental effort in order to regulate artificial intelligence, because it's very subversive, very tricky technology if we are not putting it under the proper regulation. So we need, technology itself has no moral, you know, technology is not itself bad or good, but our usage of it and how we put into the legal frame, this is very, very detrimental, you know, how technology will behave tomorrow. And also for this we need actually whole international community. Thank you. So that's...
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor Anis. Thanks so much, the audience. Thanks so much for coming. So, yeah, that's all.